So this is the beginning of Unit 2. We're going to be starting with metabolic processes, but in order to start that, we need to first look at what is metabolism and just do a bit of terminology around energy. So some terminology. The first term is work, and work is when you transfer energy from one body or place to another. Energy is just that ability to do work. We have different types. We have chemical energy, we have electrical energy, we have mechanical energy, light energy, thermal energy, and many other kinds. So energy is just the ability to do some type of work, and that work will depend on what type of energy we're discussing. And finally, metabolism. Metabolism is just the sum of all the chemical reactions in a cell. So we talked about this kind of on the first couple days. Metabolism is essentially just all of those chemical reactions that happen within a cell and within a human being or animal. Metabolism kind of encompasses all of that. Kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is energy that is possessed by moving objects. So you might have heard it referred to as a few different things, but usually within metabolic processes we talk about it in terms of kinetic energy. So it's just anything that is moving, energy that is possessed by a moving object. So for instance, it could be something outside, such as like a moving rock, or it could be something in our body, something like heart muscles contracting. That would all be kinetic energy. Potential energy is the stored energy. So potential energy is just energy that has the ability to do work. It's not currently working, but it does have the ability to do work, so it has some stored energy within it. So for example, let's look at a skydiver. So the skydiver had a plane, and the plane had to lift him up to a height that he could jump from. So that is the work portion of that. So the plane had to do work in order to get him to a height that he could jump from. When he leaves the plane, however, he has low kinetic energy and high potential energy. So when he's first leaving the plane, he doesn't have a lot of kinetic energy, so he hasn't moved a lot or dropped a lot, and so therefore his kinetic energy is very low, but he has very high potential energy. Okay, so the higher up he goes, the higher his potential energy is going to be. So he has more of ability to do work if he is higher up than if he's lower to the ground. And as he approaches the ground, it's kind of the opposite. So he has very high kinetic energy. He's been falling from the sky for quite some time, and he has low potential energy. So the closer he gets to the ground, the lower his potential energy is. So this leads us to the first law of thermodynamics, and that is called the law of conservation of energy, and you may have talked about this in physics. Law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be converted from one form to another. So what that means is we don't just come up with energy out of nowhere. Energy can't just be created out of nothing, and it doesn't just get destroyed. Okay? Energy will always be converted from one form to another. So when we talked about the skydiver, okay, his potential energy was turned into kinetic energy. Okay, so he had tons of potential energy when he was up high, and that turned into kinetic energy as he was falling through the sky. So what significance does this have to biology? Why do we care? Well, we know that energy moves from one place to another. We know that energy converts from one form to another. And if something gains energy, something had to have lost energy. Okay, and we talked about a little bit of that when we talked about redox reactions. Okay, so if something is reduced, something has to be gained. Those electrons and that energy doesn't just kind of dissolve into thin air. Okay, if something gains energy, that means something had to have lost energy. And nothing happens in isolation, meaning everything that happens in our body is affecting something else. So if energy converts from one form to another in our body, that's significant to us because we either need to create that energy from some other form, or we need to use it to conduct some sort of electrical process in our body. So for example, with photosynthesis, okay, so this is in plants, obviously not in us, but it's going to convert different types of energy. So it's going to convert light energy, okay, and where does it get that light from? Well, we know it gets it from the sun, and it's going to convert it into chemical energy. So that chemical energy is what it's going to use in order to create its food. So we can eat our food, so that's a little bit different, but plants cannot. So they have to take light energy and they convert it into chemical energy. And what is that chemical energy stored as? Well, we know that it's stored as glucose. So when it makes the glucose itself has high potential energy, but until those bonds are broken, that energy is just going to stay within the glucose molecule, but it does have the ability to do work. So it converts light energy to chemical energy. That chemical energy is stored in the animal that eats the plants, and then it gets converted to other forms of energy. So for instance, when an animal will eat that plant, or when we eat a plant, that chemical energy that we got from the plant in the form of glucose, that gets stored in us until we convert it to another form of energy. So what do we use the glucose for? Well, we're going to use it in a process called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is us converting that chemical energy into some type of other energy, usually kinetic, allowing our muscles to do work, but other times it's different type, thermal energy, different types of energy that happen within our bodies as well. Okay, so chemical energy to mechanical energy to contract muscles for movement. So we convert that chemical energy to mechanical energy, which allows our muscles to contract and allows us to move. So plants will convert the light energy to chemical energy, and then anything that eats the chemical energy, eats the plant, gets the chemical energy and converts it into some other form. So in biology, we're mostly concerned with the energy that is released or stored in chemical bonds within our body. So conversion of energy from one form into another depends on the breaking and the forming of chemical bonds in a chemical reaction. So that energy gets converted through different types depending on whether we are breaking bonds, which would release the energy, or whether we're forming bonds, which would require energy. So depending on the type of reaction that we're looking at, we're either going to be breaking or forming chemical bonds. And during a chemical reaction, the amount of potential energy changes. So when the bond is intact, the bond has a high potential energy, and once the bond is broken, the energy gets released and the potential energy will decrease. So for example, with our skydiver again, the amount of potential energy was directly related to the height of the plane. So depending on the height of the plane, that would dictate how much potential energy that skydiver had. And this is the same with chemical bonds that are happening in our body, mostly to do with electrons. So this concept is the same with potential energy of electrons. So the potential energy of electrons are directly related to their location to the positively charged nuclei. So if we remember that electrons are negatively charged, if they are close to the positively charged nuclei, that's going to change their potential energy. And if they are further away from the nuclei again, remember, is positively charged because it has positive protons and neutral neutrons in it. So the further away it is, that's going to change the potential energy of those electrons. So the further away electrons are from the nucleus, the more potential energy they have. Okay, so the further away they get from that nucleus, the further away they are from the positively charged, the more potential energy they have. Okay, so we call them that they're in an excited state. And remember, they're the ones that are in the outer valence shell, and they're the ones that have the ability to do the most work. So they transfer, they get shared, they do different things. So they have the most potential energy, the further away they are. When electrons are strongly attracted to two nuclei at the same time, the resulting forces are called a chemical bond. So when they're equally attracted to two nuclei, then it's going to create that chemical bond between two different molecules. So energy changes that happen during a chemical reaction. So some reactant bonds must be broken. Okay, so during a chemical reaction, remember, you have reactants and you have products. So some of the reactant bonds have to be broken first, and new bonds must form to make products. Okay, the reactant bonds that must be broken, this requires energy. So in order to break those bonds, it's going to require energy. In order to form new bonds to make products, it's going to release the energy. So once you have created the product, once those bonds have been broken, that's when you get energy released. And again, that energy released is usually converted into some other form. So if it was bond energy, it might get created to thermal energy. Okay, it might get created to mechanical energy, whatever, chemical energy, whatever that energy form is, it's going to be released after the products are made. So specifically when dealing with energy that is contained within bonds, bond energy is the minimum energy required to break the bonds. So we talked before about activation energy with enzymes. Bond energy is similar to that. It's the minimum energy that is required to break those bonds. And bond energy is always talked about in terms of kilojoules per mole. So bond energy is the amount of energy absorbed per mole when the bond between atoms is broken. Remember, energy is absorbed when the atoms are broken, and the amount of energy released per mole when those same bonds form. Okay, so that is bond energy overall. So how is this significant to biology again? So all chemical reactions involve the absorption of energy as bonds break in the reactants. So you're going to start with a larger molecule and we're going to break it down. And as those bonds break, we're going to absorb that energy. And it also releases the energy as the bonds form in the products. So when we break down that product, break down the reactant, and it becomes a product, it is then going to release energy. So energy will be one of your products as well. So this means that energy is always required to start a reaction. Remember we talked about up here, the absorption of energy is needed as bonds break in the reactant. So energy is always required to start a reaction. And we've seen this before, like I said, with activation energy. Okay, so that activation energy, this symbol is E with an A. So activation energy is the energy that is required to start a reaction. So activation energy is the minimum amount of energy needed to break bonds in the reactants and start the chemical reaction. So if you want to think of it kind of like that spark or the match that you need to start a fire and start combustion. Okay, so you need a minimum amount of energy required to break the bonds in the reactants and start the whole chemical reaction. And where have we seen activation energy before? With enzymes. Okay, so enzymes, same thing. In order for them to function, there's a minimum amount of energy that are required for the enzyme to do its job. Same thing here with bonds breaking. So there's a minimum amount of energy required to break those bonds in the reactants, and that is the activation energy. So types of reactions, we have an exergonic reaction, and we talked about this when we did the enzymes. So exergonic reaction is the one that releases energy, and it is spontaneous. So what spontaneous means is that after a very small push, okay, so your small push is right here, so you give a little bit of energy here within your push. So after a small push, the rest is going to occur on its own. Okay, so for example, a burning match. Once you light the match, okay, it's going to continue burning without a constant input of energy into it. So you don't have to keep relighting it constantly. After you give it that small push, you use the spark, then it's going to continue occurring on its own. Okay, this is seen in cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is going to release energy. Right, so the whole point of going through cellular respiration is when we take the glucose and we take oxygen and we create carbon dioxide, we create energy, which is the main thing that we need, and we create water as well. So cellular respiration is what we do in our cells, okay, and this is how we actually get energy. So all this energy here that is released, okay, so all of this energy here that gets released here, okay, all of that is then used in our cells. So our cells need energy to stay alive, and they need that in order to continue our bodily functions. So here's our potential energy, because they start with a lower potential energy. Their highest potential energy is when it's at its peak, and then from there it's going to release that energy. So right here, this is all energy released. An endergonic reaction is one that requires energy, okay, and that's what we call non-spontaneous. So this one requires an input of energy. And in fact, it requires a constant input of energy. So what that means is it's not spontaneous, it's not just going to happen. So we tend to think of these things kind of like a rock, a big stone on a hill, right? So if you have a huge boulder and you give it a small push, okay, it's going to continue down the hill, the rest on its way. You don't have to continue pushing it all the way down. Gravity is going to help you out there. However, if you had to push that same boulder up a hill, okay, you can't stop halfway and just expect it to continue on its own. You have to do a constant input of energy. Okay, another example is boiling a pot of water. Okay, so you have to have constant heat in order to keep that water boiling. It's not just going to continue boiling on its own without constant input of that energy. So here's my potential energy. It's very low. My reactants don't have a lot of energy, okay, and it requires a high amount of energy to get the reaction to actually happen. Once it does, then it's going to release that energy with the products, and energy actually gets absorbed here. Okay, so it's actually going to take energy, okay, from this constant input, and it's going to absorb the energy in the reaction. And where do we see this in nature? Well, this is photosynthesis. So photosynthesis requires a constant input of energy. Energy always has to be constant. It has to be an input all the time, or else it won't work anymore. And where do we get that constant input of energy? Well, it's from the sun. So if it has access to sunlight, photosynthesis will continue. Okay, if it gets cut off from the sun, if it doesn't have that constant input of energy anymore, photosynthesis will stall or it will delay. Okay, so energy of the reactants is low, your energy of the products is higher, okay, but it absorbed that energy. So it released it at some point here, but overall energy is absorbed. So you have to have a constant input of energy in order to make this happen.